Webinar will be recorded. Recording has started now, and it will be shared on the CJC's YouTube website, and a link will also be emailed to you after the conclusion of this webinar so that you can, look back on it in reference or share it with anyone else that needs to know this information. So again, welcome. My name is Rima Atung, and I am the grant coordinator for the RJ program. It would help if I turned on my camera. So I'm Rima Atung. I'm the grant coordinator for this program. Sorry about that. I just jumped in and forgot to turn on my camera. So nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. And just so you know, you feel free to ask questions at any time by either using the raise hand feature or by typing your question into the chat if the chat is open, and so that we can address your question appropriately. But again, feel free to ask questions at any time. We also set aside some time at the end for questions. So here is our agenda for today. First, we're going to go through a quick overview of the Restorative Justice Grant Program. We're going to look at some reporting requirements that are applicable to all planning grantees. Then we're going to look at some additional reporting requirements that are applicable only to those provisional grantees and some next steps related to those grantees specifically. So I do want to note that if you are not a provisional planning grantee, in other words, if you received, the full amount of your award and are contracted for the full project period from January 1st to June 30th of 2025, you don't necessarily have to stay for that additional reporting requirements piece of the presentation, though you're welcome to if you would like. And then, like I mentioned before, we'll have some questions at the end if you folks have any lingering. So first, we'll just do a quick overview of the Restorative Justice Program. Hopefully, you're familiar with some of this information by now, but I did want to include it just for your reference. So the Restorative Justice Grant was established through HB 2204 in 2021. And in the context of HB 2204, restorative justice means a community-based alternative to the criminal and juvenile legal justice systems that aims to center on the needs of the harmed party and foster accountability within the responsible party without resorting to incarceration or criminal conviction. And with HB 2204, they appropriated $4 million initially. And then in 2024, through HB 5204, they appropriated another $4 million. And your folks' awards come out of that second $4 million. I did want to note here that funding for the 2025-27 biennium is still to be determined, and hopefully we'll hear more information on that as the legislative session progresses this year. So here are the program administrative rules and operating guidelines, or links to the documents, which include the information on those. They're really helpful reference materials if you have any questions about what the grant program supports, or if you want to look at the grant administration guide for more information on CJC's grant administration process. That's a great reference material as well. I also included on this third bullet here a link to the Grant Advisory Committee meeting from 11/13 of last year, where the Grant Advisory Committee met to discuss and review your applications and provide their recommendations for the commission. Especially for those provisional folks, there's a lot of good information at that meeting. If the Grant Advisory Committee had specific questions about your application or your program, that would be a good place to find that information. As I said, links to all the relevant documents are in there, except for your contract, which you should have a copy of, that last bullet down there, which specifies, your funding amount and project period. And just a reminder to everyone, if you haven't already, please submit your signed contract to CJC as soon as possible. We're coming up quickly on that date for the first disbursement, and you won't be able to get your disbursement until the contract is executed. So please make sure you get that turned in. Any questions or comments so far? No? All right. As I said, I included just some reference, some slides on the program requirements just for your reference. For example, the definition of restorative justice. This is useful information as you move forward, especially for folks that are at the very initial stages of your planning program. It's great to like look back on these requirements and just remind yourself, okay, there's a much larger world of RJ, of restorative justice programs that exist out in the world and are great and wonderful and effective. But this specific program focuses only on the front end of the system. So it's really good to, like I said, just review these and make sure that the project that you're developing really fits within these requirements and guidelines. Again, these should look familiar to you. I'm not going to read through this slide, but this is just here for your reference. The program preferences as well. Those are the discretionary items that the Grant Advisory Committee prefers projects to include, but they're not required. And then I also wanted to remind everyone before you get started, spending your new grant funds, what allowable and unallowable uses of funds are. This slide contains a couple of examples. For example, these unallowable uses on the lower right-hand side, such as supplanting, employee bonuses, marketing or branding. But I would encourage you to look at the full list included in your grant administration guide for what is allowable and unallowable. Again, I just wanted to kind of remind you of that, put that in the forefront of your mind as you start working on or expending on these projects. So now let's get into the bulk of what we're going to talk about today, and those are the reporting requirements. As I mentioned, first, we're going to talk about reporting requirements for all grantees. Here is the timeline for when those reports are due. So the first four in this table are the reporting forms or requirements that all planning grantees need to submit to CJC. And those include the quarterly expenditure report, the quarterly program data report, although I do want to point out here that that may not apply to most programs, most of the planning grantees, because for most of you folks, your deliverable, your goal is to, conduct a survey, create a plan to implement a program. There's only a couple of folks that included providing some initial services during the development of their plan, and they're the only folks that are going to need to submit any kind of program data. So, please reach out to CJC if you think that is you. Otherwise, you don't need to submit that. Then this third form here, optional, the budget adjustment request form, as it says, it's optional. And that's only for folks that want to move funds around in their budget. And we'll get into that in a little more detail later on. And then this fourth form, semi-annual narrative question, that only occurs every 6 months. So in the table here, I've kind of outlined these columns that includes the due date for those reports. The quarterly reports that apply to all grantees, they'll open April 1st and they'll be due April 25th. And that'll be for the quarter that includes January 1st to March 31st of this year. Similarly, the quarterly report, the second one that's due, will open July 1st, close July 25th. So that due date, July 25th, is there, and it'll be for April 1st through June 30th. Any questions or comments so far? Oh, oh, but somebody else just came in. Okay. All right, so we'll move on. This table also includes these two additional reports down here for provisional grantees. And then that's going to be the provisional program grant reporting form and then the budget projection sheet that's included with that. So let's get into what these reports look like. Um, so to access the reports, what we usually do is we send out an email that tells you all the reports are open with the links. And then you will log into your SurveyMonkey Apply account, which is the same account where the applications were submitted. Um, so there's a little login button at the top. Click there. You'll get a screen that shows a little program tile, and you hit start. It looks very small and blurry on my screen. I apologize if it's small and blurry on your screen as well, but hopefully you get the gist of what it looks like. You hit the start button, and it'll bring you into this main page where you can access your reporting form. In this middle section where it says tasks, it'll list the separate forms or tasks that you need to complete. But first, we're going to talk about how you can add other people onto your account if multiple people need to access it to complete those reports. So what you do is you hit this button down here where the arrow is pointing that says Add Collaborator. It pulls up this dialog box where you can enter the email address of the person you want to invite to be able to work on the report. And then there's options down here, those little radio dial things that you can click on for view only or view and edit. So just make sure that you click the right one if you want somebody to be able to edit, send the invitation, then they can set up their login and access those reports. So back to the reporting forms themselves. As I said, they live under the tasks down here. So we're going to walk through each one, task or form by form. The first one is for the quarterly expenditure report that is built in to SurveyMonkey. So you'll need to, complete the information about the person reporting that's at the top there. And then for each budget category, like in this example is personnel, you will fill in the line item name and then the amount of funds expended for that line item. And then the form at the below all of the fill-in boxes where you put in those line items and expenditures, there's going to be a little total box that the form actually calculates the total for each budget category. So just double check those to make sure they match your records. And so that looks the same for each category in your budget. Like the next one, contractual services, then it would have the same total below it. Supplies would look the same all through the budget categories that are included in your budget. At the end of the form for the expenditures report, there's a little section where you can enter narrative comments about your expenditures. And this is very important, add a signature. Both of those need to be completed, or you can submit the report and then you click down at the bottom, mark as complete to finish that expenditure report. And then as you can see, when you go back to your main page, it'll have a little check mark to show that you did the expenditure reporting. So we're going to go through the next form now. And that's the program data report. Again, Contact us if you think that this applies to you, since it's not going to apply to everyone. You'd want to use the case level report sheet option. And then all you would do for that is if, we agree that this applies to you, you would upload that, fill in the form, upload it with the data um, that you collect for your program participants, and then hit mark as complete, which is that bottom green button there, and that will be complete. So this is the optional form, which is the budget adjustment request. And you can see on the left side here, oh, looks like there is a question. Sorry, let me just pull that up. Is there any federal money connected as a pass-through with this RJ grant program? So the RJ grant program is state funds. So as far as we know currently, all those new federal rules and restrictions aren't going to apply to this funding source, especially not for you folks that are already awarded. So hopefully that can ease your mind somewhat for right now. All right, so back to our budget adjustment request. Again, this is an optional form if you want to move funds from one budget category to another. You need to complete this form. It's available quarterly. It is not required, but it is optional. Sorry, and the first part of it is just instructions that tells you how to complete the budget adjustment form. And then the second part, here's the example of what it looks like. So it's just got a funding movement request, how many funds, the amount of funds you want to move from what category to what category, and then you fill in the rationale for why that movement needs to happen. I do want to note that if you have to complete a budget adjustment, I would recommend looking at the grant administration guide first. There's more information available in there. They are required for any budget change. If the budget change is substantial, which is if you're moving 10% or more of your total award from one budget category to another, or if there's a change in scope for your program, those actually have to get approved by the commission, which is a lengthier process, especially since these grants are only for 6 months max. Hopefully nobody has to do that, but just in case that is something that comes up, please know there's additional processing time for those more substantial budget adjustment requests. And always contact us if you have questions. So the next piece is those semi-annual narrative questions. And we're back at the main screen here where it has your task list. So I just want to point out, you can see the green check marks for the ones that are already completed. In this instant, that optional budget adjustment form wasn't completed, so there's no green check mark. If the narrative questions aren't part of that reporting quarter, they just won't be listed there. So this only lists the tasks that you have to complete for that quarter. The example that I'm using is actually the quarter that just closed. Our other restorative justice programs had to do the narrative report, so I'm logged in as one of them. But so you'll see the task at the bottom there for the semi-annual narrative questions. If you don't have to complete it, it won't be there. So I just included, like I said, the example from the quarter that just closed, but the actual questions might differ for you folks, especially since you're doing planning for an RJ program as opposed to the rest of our grantees. The longer term grantees that we've had have implemented the program already. They have clients that they're reporting on, so we might have slightly different questions. And it may include, uploading of a product, like your plan. But this is just an example of what those questions tend to look like. And as always, make sure you hit the mark complete at the bottom of any form that you finish. After you have completed all the tasks, make sure that you check to make sure all those green check marks are there on the mandatory tasks or forms that you have to complete, and then hit the submit button that's on the left side to actually submit the full report. So that brings us to the end of the reporting requirements for all of the planning grantees. Are there any questions that you guys have about those required reports? Or any other questions? No? All right. So now we're going to get into the additional reporting requirements for provisional grantees and next steps. And like I mentioned before, if you're not a provisional grantee, so in other words, if you have received all of the funds that you applied for and your project period is from January to June, you don't have to remain on the webinar for the rest of this information, although you're welcome to if you would like to. Because this is just some additional reporting requirements just for those folks. So for these examples, we're going to open the reporting as of Friday of this week. And they're going to be due March 1st. So it looks a little funny in these screenshots because there's an error message here that's highlighted in yellow because it's not open yet. Oh, I did get a question. Jessica, if we have known budget changes that need to happen now, do we fill out a budget change form now, or is it only filled out in April? So those are only available quarterly. However, you can email me with the specifics of what that budget change might be, and then I can kind of figure out what process needs to happen from there. Hopefully that answered your question, Jessica. All right, back to the provisional planning grant reporting. So as I said, this isn't open yet. It'll be open on Friday, so the tasks will appear under your task list and you'll be able to access and submit them. In this example, the buttons are grayed out, so just note that it looks a little bit different. So it's just one task that has two steps to it. So if you click on that task, it'll bring you to the form itself, which has the instructions, which is just basically a reminder of what was included in your contract and what was included in those emails that we sent back and forth where we were trying to get clarification on different aspects of the proposed planning program. So this should also look familiar, but we do need to go through the formal process of making sure those questions that the GAC asked, those concerns that they had on whether or not those planning projects fit under the scope of restorative justice and were fundable through this program. We have to make sure to review all those things so that those requirements to make sure those requirements have been met. So this provisional planning grant reporting form is your your opportunity to do that, to provide that information that will then be reviewed by the Grant Advisory Committee. So the form includes those instructions at the top. That's just a reminder of all of that stuff. And it includes only 2 questions, so it's fairly simple. And the questions are pretty straightforward. Hold on just a second. Very small and blurry on my screen, so I'll read them out to you. Oops. My apologies. The first one is just, detail any adjustments you have made to your initial proposed planning project to comply with the provisional funding requirements and meet the definition of restorative justice. And we included some examples such as changes to your project description, changes to your client target population, client eligibility requirements. So that's really where you want to um, address or show changes to that initial application, um, where there were those specific questions about how your planning grant may or may not fit under restorative justice. And like I said, I know we've gone back and forth on email with this several times. But if you want to just include, your revised project description or your revised target population or whatever the question or concern was in that space, then that will be very helpful. The second question is describe how the components of your project have been amended to meet the definition of planning and what the revised intended outcomes of your project are. So again, there were a couple questions and concerns from the grant advisory committee for those provisional folks, that the scope didn't quite fit within planning. So that's where you're going to want to include the information that shows you've made those made those adjustments um, to your proposed project description so that they now fit under planning. And, as I have noted here again, that 1113 GAC meeting recording is there for your reference. If you have any concerns or if you want to know what they talked about during that discussion, that's going to be your best point of reference. Um, and then so it's just those two narrative questions that you put your response into. And then the third piece is the budget projection sheet upload. So there's instructions there on what that includes. And then you just upload. It's the same budget form you use to fill out for the initial application. So hopefully you're familiar with that now. The only difference is we're asking you, since you had that provisional award and where you received, where you will receive, half the amount that you initially applied for, what you want to make sure to do when you submit this budget adjustment form, is make sure that if you have underspent at all, that initial, distribution of funding, if you have anything left over there, that's accounted for in the budget for that last 3 months of the project period. So we call this carryover funding. That's just money from your current contract that you anticipate not being spent before March 31st, that then gets carried over into those second 3 months. Um, so you want to make sure that you subtract that out of whatever your total budget needs are. There's a little bit more information there in the instructions. If you have any questions, please let us know. But like I said, the funding form itself, there's a little snapshot of it on the right here. It looks exactly the same as the one you submitted with your application. So same. Oh, excuse me, I hit forward accidentally. So the same itemized, list by budget category. You add a little bit of narrative on the form for um, each of your items that you're requesting. Again, refer back to the grant administration guide for allowable and unallowable expenses and make sure to exclude your carryover funds. I think that's everything for the budget form. Um, so for, like I said, all you have to do is upload that. You hit that green button at the bottom, and then don't forget to hit the submit, the overall submit button um, on the left side there. Right now it's grayed out. It won't be grayed out once it's open. Any questions about that additional reporting for the provisional planning grantees? Hopefully it's pretty straightforward, but as I mentioned, we're here for any questions. Um, so for the provisional folks, like I said, the reporting is going to open January 31st for those additional reports. They're due March 1st. We have a grant advisory committee meeting scheduled for March 10th from 9 to noon, where we're going to review those reports that you submit. Make sure that any of those concerns that the grant advisory committee had when they were making the recommendations are addressed. And based on that review, then they're going to recommend whether or not to award the remainder of the funds in that initial up to amount that you requested. Um, so they're going to review March 10th, then the CJC Commission takes those recommendations and also reviews the information in the regular monthly commission meeting, either in March or April, and then they'll make those award authorizations for that remainder, that second half of the funding that isn't included in your provisional contract right now. So for anyone who gets awarded that funding, we will then distribute um, amendments for your contract that will, give you that second half of funding up to the amount that was initially authorized that you applied for, and also extend your grant period from January to March 31st, to include April to June 30th for the full 6 months. Hope that makes sense. Please let me know. There's another question. Has any funding for any provisional or planning grant applicant been paid out yet? So for folks that have submitted their signed contract back, um, the first disbursement date is January 30th, so tomorrow. That's included in that contract. It can take a little bit longer for the state to process those checks when the contract or amendment is newly signed. So, it should be going out imminently. So keep an eye out for that, for your disbursements, and let me know if you don't see them within the next week or so. If you haven't signed your contract yet, do that and get it back to us as soon as possible, please. Um, all right. So here is our contact information um, for just our primary contacts for this project. You may see other names in the email chains, but again, I'm Rima. Avery is our main guru for everything. She sends out a lot of reporting emails and whatnot, so you might see her name. So our contact information is included there. Any more questions, comments, anything CJC can help you with as we move forward with the planning grants? All right, I'm not seeing anything. Well, means we got through all of the information a little earlier than anticipated. So we'll go ahead and end here. Like I said, we'll send out the recording. We'll send out copies of the slide presentation. Be sure to reach out. We're here to help. And we look forward to seeing what these new planning grants come up with. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your afternoon.